Welcome to Growing Up, a podcast about children and young people. These podcasts were written and produced in association with the Living Assessments Project and funded by the Wellcome Trust.
This is the Spotlight series. I am Monique, your host from the University of Kent, and in this series my guests share their childhood memories from the UK and elsewhere in the world, from World War II to the 21st century, all true life stories, all unique reflections of their era. In this episode, Rosalind describes her childhood in 1960s and 70s Kent, with education at private school and beautiful holidays abroad. And then there was also the freedom to go clubbing as a young teenager. Does this sound perfect? Well, maybe not. Rosalind will explain how things were more tricky than we might think.
I'm Rosalind. I was born in 1961 in Rochester, which is in Kent, and I was raised in Gravesend, although I went to school in a little town near Gravesend called Higham. The school was called Gad's Hill Place School, and it was the former home of the writer Charles Dickens. So it was a wonderful place to go to school every day. The grounds and the actual building obviously had lots of memorabilia of Charles Dickens. I had an older sister, 3 years older than me, and we grew up in a terraced house in Gravesend. My father was a journalist and my mother actually was a school teacher for primary school. That was coincidental because she wasn't trained, but she was asked and she went along. I had a grandma who lived next door to us, which was wonderful. And we used to go in through a gate, so we've spent lots of time in my grandma's home and garden. My extended family consisted of 3 boy cousins and my grandparents. I didn't know my paternal grandfather. He had died before I was born.
Who was very much around in your daily life? I understand that maybe your parents worked full-time?
Yes, my mother did, but it was sporadic. So she wasn't a full-time teacher, but she obviously taught when we were at school. So it was my sister and myself and my mother. My father, although was present, was never really on any of our sort of trips that we did. He was always working. He was a sports journalist, so he was very much cricket in the summer at the weekends, reporting on that, or football in the winter. So my mother was the main caregiver and she was very much around, and we had an interest in life. We went to a really good school. It was a private school, and although it wasn't that academic, looking back now, I realised that it sort of gave me the confidence to make me think that I was as good as everyone else, although I realise I wasn't now in hindsight. And as far as holidays, because my father also owned a travel agents, and we had the most wonderful holidays back then in the 60s. We were lucky enough when I was 4 to go to New York on the Queen Elizabeth and return on the Queen Mary. I mean, that was amazing. It really was. And it wasn't because we had money. It was because he had these trips that travel agents get, from cruise lines or airlines, etc. So, we had some wonderful holidays for the time.
That is truly extraordinary. I'll have to ask you more about your holidays later. What is your first memory of your childhood?
My first memory was probably sitting on my mother's lap in the living room and her telling me a story that she was making up. And I was absolutely riveted by this story. And yes, just a memory of her being close to me, sitting on her lap, feeling secure, feeling safe. And also I have this memory as well as a little girl, and I guess it was when I was about 4 or 5, but I do remember looking at her and she was with friends eating lunch and I was with them, so I couldn't have been at school because the other children were at school. I remember looking at her and thinking how much I loved her.
What is your best holiday memory?
We used to go to Switzerland and we would spend our holidays in Switzerland, and they were pretty special. I think my parents chose a hotel. They knew the hotel owners. Their children spoke English, so we had these children to play with, and we used to go to the lake in Switzerland and swim. So that was pretty special.
Indeed, that sounds so privileged.
Again, my parents only rented the property that we had in Gravesend. So when they decided to buy, when I was 9 years old, they bought a holiday home. It was right on the beach. And so most of our holidays, even as a teenager, were at this holiday home that they owned. And so, yes, I have memories of just day trips with friends spending the day on the beach.
Can you tell us what is your first memory of school?
So I actually remember my first day at school, funnily enough, and I guess you can always know when it's a memory because there's no picture of this, just like there was no picture of that emotion of me looking at my mother and feeling that love. So I do remember sitting in what was called kindergarten, and actually maybe it wasn't my first day, but it was certainly the first memory, and I was to colour in these great big letters, which were obviously the alphabet. So you coloured in the A, you coloured in the B, and I do remember sitting there doing that and feeling very important.
Well, you were very important. Where was your school as compared to your home, and how did you get there?
That's sort of a good question, because this is when I realised how I was quite a nervy type of child, because the school was a good 25 minutes away and my father would take us in the morning, but it was a problem getting home because my mother didn't drive. So various lifts were given by other mothers, but at a very young age I had to get the bus home with a teacher because I only did half days in kindergarten, so I couldn't have been more than 5. And I had to get this bus home into the town and then change and go on another bus with the teacher, but she got off one bus stop before my mother could pick me up. So that's a good question. I remember that being unpleasant and nerve-wracking because as the teacher got off and said to the bus conductor, could you make sure this little girl is with her mother at the next bus stop? I often thought, well, what if my mother's not there? So that was weird to be doing. I mean, you just wouldn't be doing that now, would you? That couldn't happen, I guess. But it did then, and I'm still here.
Was it a school bus or was it a bus that's for any customer?
It wasn't a school bus. It was the bus that came from the town.
Did you like school?
Initially, yes. As a little girl, and I mean up until the age of about 10, I did like school and I liked lessons. But this was a school that went from the age of 5 to 16. So there were children who left at 11 and went on to other schools or maybe did the 11 plus. But I stayed and other children came, obviously, at that age. I'm afraid I wasn't a very good pupil after about the age of 11. I could blame it on other students, couldn't I, and say I was easily influenced by those who were more interested in boys and going out. My education took a bit of a nosedive and I didn't enjoy school, for which I am sorry. I'm sorry when I look back that I didn't make the most of it. I didn't make the most of my education, but no, it wasn't a good experience for me.
Did you sometimes skip lessons?
It wasn't the sort of school that you could skip lessons. It was a small school and there was only about 12 to a class. No, that you were dropped off in the morning and you went in that gate. So no, it wasn't that sort of a school. No, I didn't skip lessons, but I just didn't make the most of my education. I could blame teachers for that, but I would say it was a mix of being scared of some of the teachers and not doing well, but also a lack of curiosity on my part at that age and not making the most of my education. And then I could also blame my parents and say that they didn't really push me or encourage me, or they didn't seem to be interested in my progress. I crammed it in right at the end, so I got a few good grades, but I wasn't put in for a lot of the subjects. So I could have done well in French, but I wasn't put in for it because I didn't show the effort. I ended up with a few, I would say about 5 GCSEs, which were then O-levels.
And you say your parents didn't seem to be that bothered about it?
No, I would say that my mother really didn't seem to be interested in our homework or what we were meant to do. And my father was too busy. He maybe could have helped, but again, he was working and wasn't around really to sort of help us. I do remember, though, that my father did take me to see Macbeth just before the English, before the GCSEs, and he did take me to see that, and it did help. So they must have thought about it, but on the whole, there wasn't that push that maybe I needed.
So I understand that it was the same for your sister.
That's interesting, isn't it? It's this nature and nurture. My sister, naturally, she was more self-regimented, she worked harder than me, and she was more interested. So she did far better than me and did go on to a grammar school to do her A-levels.
Did you do sports at school?
Well, we had lovely playing fields, and yes, we did do sports. I was good at tennis. I was scared of the ball in hockey, and I wasn't very sporty. But sports were a part of our curriculum, yes, and I enjoyed it.
Were you aware of groups, cliques, little gangs amongst pupils, and were you part of one?
Yes, in those teen years, we were very aware of cliques and gangs, and yes, I was part of one, and probably the gang that was the most, can I say, influential, or not influential, but what you would consider now a little bit of sort of bullying tactics involved. So yes, I was aware of that, and it wasn't always pleasant, as every child knows.
Would we call it the cool gang?
Well, yeah, I think we thought that at the time, but obviously it makes me cringe now.
I was going to ask you if you've experienced or witnessed behaviours that we would call bullying nowadays in your school.
Probably, but when I look back on my school, we behaved. It was strict. I don't know whether you can compare it now. Yes, I think bullying went on. Probably girls felt bullied by what was said, but I don't remember it being taken so seriously as it is now. I might be wrong because I was a child. I was a teenager, so I wasn't thinking about it. But I don't think people thought about it as much as they do now. It was just tolerated more then than it is now. And it shouldn't have been, but if you said anything, it didn't really go anywhere. A bit like sexual harassment now. If you said anything back in the 70s, no one would have taken you seriously and there was no one to report anything to.
Were there any disabled children at your school?
When I look back now, I think about there were many children with learning disabilities that I look back on now, or maybe that would be considered now, have some sort of an autistic trait that could have been dealt with or would have been dealt with now, acknowledged and recognised, and support would have been there.
So if you remember them, obviously those features were noticeable. How would you say they were treated by their peers or by the teachers?
I just remember one girl who came back to an old girls' reunion, so not so long ago, and she actually said, I had dyslexia, I know now, I was on the spectrum and I know that now. And I do remember, and she was a lovely girl, so she had a lovely personality, but I think she was just treated as if she was doing it on purpose or not trying hard enough or not getting the point. And I hate to say it, but just considered not intelligent enough to understand. And I think a lot fell by that wayside, unfortunately. It was all classed together as stupid.
Thank you for that example. A trick question. If you were to remember your school as a smell, what would it be?
Well, I think it would have to be the smell of the fields and the cut grass, something like that. Probably a sound would be doves or pigeons cooing.
Now, Rosalind, would you like to tell us a bit more about your childhood and your experiences and maybe the dynamics within your household and your friends?
I remember my childhood as happy, for the most part. Obviously, we all look back and sort of think where it could have been better, but I definitely felt that I had parents who loved me and I felt that we were put first. And I know we were planned for, we were both planned for. But I will say my father was a nervous type and he used to become quite het up and stressed quite easily, and it was visible. So, you used to feel quite nervous around him. And my mother was more capable, but she was equally nervous, subtly so, but she was equally nervous. And she was also emotionally volatile. You can imagine I have to say, I look back on my childhood and I sort of always felt on the alert. When would anything sort of just explode? When would there be some sort of, argument? It was pretty sort of, emotionally volatile, I would say. But, one cousin of mine quoted recently that our childhood days, because we spent them together, was a sort of an Enid Blyton type days. We'd spend summer holidays, we'd go down to the local swimming pool with our parents. This is when we were quite young, in 6, 7, 8. As we got older, my parents rented a beach hut by the sea, so that I remember lovely days there. And then, as I said before, they bought a holiday home and we were lucky enough to travel abroad. We were very lucky. Looking back on my school days, I was quite happy there, and I do feel it gave me the confidence to make me feel as if I was as good as everyone else. But clearly it was an academic school. Few students went on to university, but then they didn't in the 70s. I do feel the school's grounding, though, gave me the confidence. But in reality, my education wasn't very good. And that was my fault as much as anyone's. The dynamics in my family, so difficult. It was difficult when I look back. As I said, father who was very stressful and used to panic, visibly panic and get uptight about the smallest things, and a mother who would then tolerate it to the point where she couldn't anymore and then snap and explode, and anyone who was near her would cop it. So yeah, it wasn't always idyllic. Again, in hindsight, I realised that it's made me very nervous and stressful as an adult. As a teenager, I was very good at home. My mother always can't believe how well behaved I was at home, but I was really naughty at school. But she had no idea that I was naughty at school until she came down to the school for school play or something, and the headmistress told her how naughty I'd been, and she couldn't believe it. And again, I look back and I think I probably could act out at school, whereas I couldn't at home because I was too scared. So that's interesting.
The arguments coming from your parents, was it amongst themselves or directed at you, the children?
When we were children, the arguments weren't directed at us. It was between them, and it was usually something really trivial. They just didn't know how to express themselves other than to let rip. So that's what they did.
How did you and your sister react?
I can't really speak for how my sister felt or how she reacted. I don't remember leaving the room, but it was unsettling and it was unnerving, and yeah, I didn't like it. I wanted it to go back to how it was and be calm again.
Did you have a best friend?
At the age of 11, 12, 13, I had a best friend, and she started at the school at about 11 or 12, and we were really close and tight, and I'd spend days at her house and she'd spend days at my house, and yes, I did have a best friend. And I think she was the one that sort of, I guess because I spent so much time at her house, I got to see how others lived. Because, you don't know your family, what's different and what could be dysfunctional until you experience other people's families and think, oh, this doesn't go on at my house, or this does go on, or everything seems calm here. So, yes, her family, obviously they had their own issues, I'm sure, like every family. But, it was different, and she was a good friend to me in those days.
So what did you do when you were together, you two?
Well, this is where my schooling lacked, because this friend and I were already at the discos at the age of 13, can you believe? And our favourite pastime was looking for boys, meeting boys, dancing, talking about fashion, all at the young age of 13. We did a lot of walking around the town, just looking at clothes, buying clothes, going to the disco on a Wednesday night, always a school night at that. That continued until we left school at 16. We were quite thick until then. Thick friends, I mean.
Your parents let you go out on a Wednesday night?
My father was appalled and didn't want us to go out, but my mother thought it was important that we had some social life. I think it came from her upbringing where her father wouldn't allow her out. She resented that, so she made sure that we could go out.
To get back to the time you spent as a family, can you tell me on a day-to-day basis if you ate your meals together and what was your favourite time of the day?
No, we didn't eat our meals together because my dad always came in quite late. So it would be my mother and myself and my sister, and then he would come in later. But at the weekend, we always had a Sunday lunch, usually burnt roast. And then there'd be that, which people can probably remember again in the 60s, early 70s, that sort of like 4 o'clock tea on a Sunday, which consisted of jam tarts and jelly. Yeah. I tell you what my mother did, which was lovely. She used to do Angel Delight, which was a packet of chocolate powder whipped up with milk, and then she'd sprinkle chocolate flake on it, and I always thought that was a big treat. She'd do cauliflower cheese and she'd add crisps, which I thought was quite good. I don't have any memories of a favourite meal. It's all sort of typical English fare.
Any particular foods you disliked?
No, I was a good eater. I'd eat anything that was put in front of me.
Have you had any experience of going into hospital as a child?
Yeah, my sister and I were playing on a Sunday evening. My mother was upstairs having a bath. My father had just had a bath. My sister and I were playing a game called You Can't Touch the Floor. in the living room. I was 9. As I tried to jump, I cut myself on my head, and my parents had to take me to hospital, and I had stitches in my head, and it was all very scary. But that's the only experience of hospital as a child. I have to say, for all my parents' nervous, stressy behaviour, they did jump into action that night. I mean, my father was in his dressing gown. My mother had come out the bath. One of them had me down in the bathroom floor holding my head together because it was cut in my forehead and it was quite deep. And my father quickly went and got the car and they got me in there really quickly. My father carried me into the hospital and it was all done really quickly and efficiently. And funnily enough, when there really was an emergency, they seemed to act on it really well.
So Rosalind, in general, when would you say you were the happiest during your childhood, and any precise events?
The happiest were the younger years that I remember from my first memories up until my sister and I reached those teenage years, which were really the worst years, difficult years. And not just because we were teenagers and hormones were ranging, but because my mother reacted so badly to us at teenage years. I think she was so scared of anything going wrong that she sort of controlled us through fear. And although she wanted us to go out and be out and about, she was also scared as well. The best years were before we were teenagers. They were happy. I think my mum was at her happiest then. We were safe indoors with her. And yeah, they were sort of the carefree years.
Okay. And when you were upset or worried, who would you go to for comfort?
Mainly my mother. She was really good like that. She'd want you to confide in her, and I did lots of times and all the time. So yes, it would be her I'd go to.
Reflecting back, how would you describe your childhood in a few words?
Okay, so in a few words, I always felt very safe and wanted and loved, but emotionally it was very volatile. And as I said earlier in this podcast, it was as if I was on the alert the whole time. And the result of that is that I'm a very nervous, stressful person.
Is there an object from your childhood that holds a particular emotional importance to you?
We do get an ornament out each Christmas that I remember buying my mother when I was about 6, and I thought it was wonderful. It was a white reindeer, and that is still on our Christmas tree each Christmas, so that's lovely, and that I hold dear.
Can you see today the influence your childhood experiences and upbringing have had on the person you are now?
Yeah, I've had to learn a lot about myself, and it's taken a lifetime to understand who I am and why I am who I am, and we don't want to repeat the imperfections of our parents, and of course everyone's imperfect. That's not the issue. But yes, it's taken me a long time, and I do understand why I am who I am and my flaws, and due to the way I was raised. There's positive, but there's also negative, and as I said, it's taken us a long time. And my sister and I still to this day, and we're both in our 60s, we discuss in detail our childhood. It seems like we can't let it go because we both have negative emotions about it, which is a shame, but that's the way we feel. And I feel lucky that I've got her to refer back to with, because she understands exactly what it was like, and she understands how I felt and I understand how she felt. So I treasure that, but I also feel that we do tend to discuss it a lot. The imperfections of our parents, or the flaws, the negative impact they've had on us, but also the positive. You have to sort of weigh it up.
And on the one hand, it helps to share. On the other hand, it ends up being a vicious circle or entertaining a negative feeling. It's a difficult one.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. We do talk about it too much, and we should lay it to rest. And we're looking at this through the prism of the present. Back in the 60s and 70s, we're talking as if those same parents who lived through the war were raised thinking about how the child felt, and it wasn't about, the child wasn't asked their opinion in those days, the child wasn't considered, and we've got to remember that. It was a different way of raising children, and it's easy to look back and think where they went wrong. Well, yes, but they didn't have psychological knowledge that we all have now.
Is there a particular smell, taste, or food that takes you back in time?
There is one smell, and it's Chanel No. 5, and my mother wears it not anymore, but she did wear it, and it definitely has a massive impact on me when I smell that.
So chic. What advice would you give to your 10-year-old self?
To ask for things to be explained and to maybe stick up for myself more and try and ask for reasonable answers to be given. I don't know whether that makes sense, and be kinder to myself.
Thank you so much, Rosalind, for sharing your memories with us.
Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed this episode, follow us on Twitter at living_assess. To find out more, search online for the Living Assessments Project.